Thank you very much, Daniel, for such a fantastic talk. We were very lucky. The internet connection behaved perfectly until
That's
now.
a small miracle. That's a miracle.
With no jitters or anything. So, before I move to so I'll give people some time to reflect and get warmed up to ask questions. So I'll start asking questions myself. And before we move to the more technical stuff, I would like very much for us to tell us a little bit about your project, Portraits of Resilience, your photography.
Oh, I'm sorry. Absolutely, I'd be delighted. Yes, so we like many colleges throughout the world and in the United States, we had a terrible spate of suicides in 2014, 2015. It's been going on for a long time, but it peaked then, and a lot of very serious mental health problems that I think have been getting worse over the years. And I was very eager to do something in my university to see if I could make a small contribution to addressing this problem. And the idea that I had was to make a gallery of portraits of students and faculty and administrators who had experienced mental health challenges and had stories to tell about how they'd come to terms with very difficult mental health problems, whether they were depression, bipolar disorder, trauma, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so on. And so I photographed about 20 different students and faculty and administrators, and they each verbatim told a quite extraordinary story about their experience. And then I published a book comprising these verbatim stories with the portraits. And so that's been the project, and it's the truth is it was a wonderful project because I learned so much from these amazing people. And they had so many insights, not just about coping with depression and anxiety and so on, but just with how to deal with life, how to live a wise life. The book, I should say, was very generously supported by a bunch of different philanthropic funds. So I was able to have my dream of a book that was beautifully printed from a photographic point of view, but was still affordable. So we were able to discount the book very heavily. And the book has been available. In fact, in 1 year, we gave a copy of the book using a donation from some very generous alumni. We gave a copy of the book to every incoming freshman. But that's essentially the story of my book.
That's great.
And by the way, I want to say that if people are interested, I send out a monthly postcard, which is like a little inspirational message with a photograph. And if you want to sign up for that, I'd be delighted. Just go to portraitsofresilience.com and you'll find a link there under join.
Oh, that's great. I mean, of course, this is a problem everywhere nowadays, right? There's an epidemic of mental health, especially in academia. Could you share some of these insights that you had about this in doing this project?
Well, gosh, it's a big topic, but I will say that I think a couple of points. The first is that it's universal, that the incidence of mental health challenges amongst students and faculty is enormous. I think faculty is somewhat in denial. Students are much more honest about it, but I think a lot of faculty suffer from it too. I would say also that we are not only not addressing the problem, but in many respects we're exacerbating the problem, particularly because we often are not very good at sharing our own vulnerabilities, and because we have created such a highly competitive environment, and because we often judge people by such trite measures as, their grade point averages or their salaries or the number of fellowships or internships they have and so on. And so I'm very concerned that we've set up a competitive environment that leads people to fail, and that I think we need as a society to rethink the whole way that we think about success.
I fully agree. And thanks for doing this great service to the community, Daniel.
Oh, thank you.
When so in the quote I mentioned in the beginning, in presenting you, there is this part that stands out or stood out for me, that you say that software functionality lies in the meeting point of human and machine. Of course, this reminds me of your father's work, in particular his work with Pamela Zave, and the connection to requirements in the interface of the computer, the machine, and the human. So I was wondering if this was intentional, and more generally, if you could elaborate on his influence on your work.
Oh, sure. Well, yes. I mean, I've certainly been influenced by that in thinking that it's an important part of the work of a software designer or someone who does research in software design to think about the problem domain and to think about a system as not just having a specification that somehow is magical and comes out of thin air and is not something that we should even talk about, but rather is something that's a very important focus. And I've been very influenced by that idea. And of course, in the field that you're such a leader in, Giancarlo, and this notion of conceptual modeling, this idea of recognizing the importance of the problem domain is really central. And I've taken that very seriously, been very influenced by that in my father's work. At the same time, and by the way, that's in contrast to what I think is a very familiar and traditional computer science point of view that was perhaps best articulated by Edgar Dijkstra, who distinguished what he called the correctness problem, which was whether or not a software implementation satisfied its specification, from what he called the pleasantness problem, which was whether or not you had the right specification. And I think this was somewhat mischievous of him, because I think in calling it the pleasantness problem, in making it only a question of whether or not the specification was pleasant, he somewhat denigrated it and said, oh, it's just a sort of matter of taste. But I don't think it's a matter of taste. I think if you have the wrong specification, you can be in real trouble. Now, in the case of the work that my father and Pamela Zave did, their focus was on showing that if you had the wrong specification, you could end up violating a critical requirement in the environment, whether that requirement is, to shut down a nuclear reactor before it gets critical and so on, to cause a car to break before it has an accident. So those ideas have all been very influential. I will say there is one crucial difference, which is that my father has taken the point of view that it's sort of not the business of software developers to think about requirements, that someone comes in and tells the software developer what the requirement is, and it's the software developer's job to build a system to that requirement. And I think this is a very reasonable point of view. He would point out, well, if you allow yourself to come up with the requirement, then there's a strategic goal for the requirement and there's no end. Then you're going to be concerned about what the company's strategy is, or whether the company should even exist, whether it's in a good business. You can then get to political levels and so on. But I don't take that point of view, because I'm very interested in what I think is the essence of software design, where I think in the design of many applications, we are really inventing requirements, where we're inventing specifications and requirements and inventing purposes, that we believe are critical to people, but which might not yet have been articulated. And so in that respect, my work is a little bit different. I guess the other respect in which my work has been very influenced by my father is that I'm very interested in trying to be as systematic as possible. As you've seen in this talk, I've not yet succeeded in making concept design very systematic, but I would like very much to have very objective criteria by which you can judge notions of integrity and familiarity and so on. And I'd like to move towards those goals.
Thank you. Following up exactly on that, actually, so it seems to me that you have an approach that it's actually comes very close to ontological analysis, right? You're really searching for the essence of things. So in one sense, I guess I get this impression listening to your talk that you are really trying to separate essence from accidents in a sense. So for example, if you were to talk about signatures and digitally signing documents, I think you would tell me that digitally signing documents is not about, etching digital ink over digital paper, but this is about authentication, and this is about auditability, and it's about a speech act that provides documentality and so on. So would you agree to that there is something there which searching for essence of things?
I would absolutely agree to that. And in fact, that's a very interesting example, because one of the first concept design problems that I noted, I did a lot of work analyzing early versions of Adobe Acrobat, which had very complicated and I think confused concept design. And one of the delightful concept design flaws in Adobe Acrobat was that there was a concept that allowed you to physically sign a document, in which essentially you could just put in a signature or any other kind of image into the document. And there was, and when you did that, it wouldn't actually let you do that until you actually associated it with your digital identity, which actually required logging into Adobe's site. So that meant that even if I wanted to, write at the bottom, love from Daniel on, in a handwriting, in a personal message, I couldn't do that without getting onto Adobe's site and using my digital identity. And my analysis of that was that they had essentially conflated and brought together two different concepts. One was the concept of simply adding a signature as an image element to the PDF, and the other is the one you're talking about, which is a real digital authentication. And by merging and by being unclear about which of these was actually in play, they really made things very hard for the user. I will say that I would draw two distinctions between my work and what I think has been classically done in ontologies. The first is this observation that I would argue that concepts are not sort of out there in the world, that most of them are invented. That doesn't mean that that many of them won't be out there in the world, but they were invented at some time. So the notion of a digital identity, or any kind of identity, the notion of a social security number, the notion of a restaurant reservation, these are concepts that were invented by somebody at some time. It turns out the restaurant reservation was invented in the late 19th century. The social security number was invented in the 1930s. So these notions, they don't just exist in the problem domain, like the concept of dog or the concept of house, the way the philosophers would think about concepts. They were invented. And so I think I take the point of view that it's more productive to think of them as being invented and created rather than discovered. The second distinction I would draw is that I think in ontological modeling, there hasn't been so much work on trying to tease apart all the different concepts. And what I'm really trying to say is that, yes, in the end, you will essentially have a data model that through these synchronizations connects together all these different concepts. But I would like to be able to identify the concepts independently, analyze their own ontologies or data models, and think of them as essentially being plugged together.
Oh, there are so many interesting points that I could follow from that. So I'll start with this idea of constructs being invented. This is I see what you're saying, and it seems that you're sponsoring an idea of a constructivist view, a nominalist view on concepts, and you take this pragmatic approach on the behavior of concepts. So concepts are as good as they are useful to do something, right? However, I don't think you would say that concepts are arbitrary in the sense that anything goes. So you're actually going the opposite direction. You're saying it's important to think about which concepts, right? Where these concepts come from, and you attach this to this idea of purpose and so on. So, one idea that comes to my mind is this idea of a colleague of yours, Frank Kyle, from the cognitive science department at MIT. He has this idea that nominal concepts like reservations or, let's say traffic laws, they are, or chairs, if you like, artifacts and what he calls the nominal kinds. There is a nexus binding the elements of the concept together, but which are not internal. They are external to the concept. So, for example, chairs, of course, chairs were invented, but the properties of chairs come from the properties of human beings, the weight range and the size of limbs and things like that. And it's arbitrary that we have, if you drive on the left or on the right, but choosing one side is not arbitrary. It has to do with our capacity to react to traffic conditions and the consequence to human bodies and so on. So would you agree that, although they are invented, there is some nexus somewhere that explain why certain concepts are good and better than other concepts?
No, I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think, but that isn't that the nature of invention, that, you know, that we try to invent things that are good and that work well. I think the other aspect that you're pointing out so articulately is that concepts involve not only a protocol on the computer side, and this connects to the work my father did with Pamela Zave also, but they involve a protocol on the human side, that to use a concept, you have to behave in a certain way. I mean, just to give you the most simple example, you know, the concept of a password, for example, relies not only on you being able to remember your password, but you not writing your password on a sticky and putting it all over the place so other people can see it. Right. So the concept is not only that the system has, you know, a hashed and salted collection of passwords and so on, but that the user obeys some kind of protocol in the use of those passwords. And so I think that is extremely important. And in every one of these scenarios, what makes the concept good is that the protocol that is imposed on the user is one that is good for the user, that the user is likely to participate in. And I think this is also very interesting because it points to the fact that in design in general, we often get surprises from what Christopher Alexander would call the context of the use. And computer scientists are sometimes not very aware of this because they think so much about internal defects. But just to give you one example, if you take the ticket concept, right? So the idea is that if you want to go to a, I want to go to a concert or something, not that we do that kind of thing so much anymore, at least in the United States, that I can buy a ticket in advance, and that ticket will allow me then subsequently to have access to the concert. Now, what we all know from our real world experience of tickets is that there is a problem of, what's called scalping, that if you put, 1,000 tickets out there for sale, someone might buy them all up, the entire collection of tickets, essentially, and then monopolize the market and then try and sell all those tickets at a higher price. So that's a flaw in the concept of ticket, which is induced entirely by the user behavior. And whether or not scalping is going to be a problem for your ticket concept, you'll have to judge in terms of the context of usage. But it also tells us that the design of any artifact, software or otherwise, is dependent on understanding how human beings will interact with it.
That's a great point. Actually, your idea of concept seems to be not exactly the idea of concept that people have, for example, in ER diagrams or in UML, but I think it really reminds me of a notion of pattern, right? And actually, when you're talking about it and talking about the associations with other things and the operational principle, and you actually even hinted in the direction of anti-patterns when you talk about known issues in the usage of the concept and so on. So it really reminds me of this idea of pattern even more than in the Gang of Four sense, in the original Christopher Alexander sense, as a pattern of behavior.
No, that's exactly right. And you, Giancarlo, have done some very interesting work in anti-patterns of conceptual modeling yourself. I mean, I see the two as completely consistent. I think that on the one hand, yes, you're right that my notion of concept is very influenced by Alexander's notion of pattern and the success that the Gang of Four patterns have had, and a desire to replicate that kind of success in the domain of design, the design of functionality, not the design of internal structure of the code. But at the same time, these patterns, for me, the essence of the pattern is that the pattern is a state machine with an abstract data model, which is an ontology, and a collection of actions that modify that ontology. So in that sense, my individual patterns are very much rooted in the tradition of conceptual modeling and ontologies and formal methods and so on.
There are many questions here from the audience, so I'll ask one final question. I have many questions myself, but we can talk about it in another time. So your one-to-one mapping between purpose and concepts really reminds me of Paul Grice's work on conversational maxims. I don't know if you're familiar with that, these cooperative principles in philosophy of language. Was that accidental, or were you inspired by Grice's work?
I actually don't know Rice's work, so I'd be delighted if you educate me and give me a link to that. I was actually quite influenced by the work of a mechanical engineering researcher called Nam Su, who has a theory of design called axiomatic design. And he has what he calls the independence axiom. And the independence axiom is very closely related to my notion of overloading.
Okay, I see. Great. I'll move to the questions from the audience now. So the first one is again, so this actually comes from Daniel Schwab, who's also a great photographer. So he says, how do you see the relation of concepts and photography?
Oh, gosh. Wow, that's a really difficult question. I mean, clearly, I think, you know, that concepts play a role in photography, and that there are certain sort of patterns of there are patterns of relationships and images that evoke certain kinds of emotions. But I would have to say that the use of those patterns in photography is often not inspiring and often produces rather routine pictures. And for me, the essence of photography is to find some kind of nexus between the structure and the aesthetics of the image and some emotional idea. And so I think it's a little bit different, but I'm intrigued by that idea, so I'll think about it more. And if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear from you. So send me an email, tell me if you have a better take on it than I do. I'm sure you do.
Do you see the concept of concept as referring only to nouns or also to other general terms like verbs or adjectives?
I don't see concepts as just nouns. I mean, I think, you know, a concept is really, in my notion of a concept, it's really a collection of nouns and relationships and behaviors. So it's, you know, I think of I suppose the most straightforward understanding is that a concept is really a machine. It's a machine that has a structure or an ontology. But it's an entire machine. And so I resolve the question of, you know, how many concepts are there in this entity relationship diagram by saying that for the reservation concept or the folder concept, every one of those elements in the data model belongs to the single concept, and that they aren't separate concepts in their own right.
Mm-hmm. In the case of redundancy, when two concepts have the same purpose, shall we say that we have a single concept? If not, how can we distinguish them? So is the identity of concepts tied to the identity of purposes?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think no, they're not, because at least in the case of labels and categories, for example, in Gmail, those two different concepts have distinct behaviors. If they had identical behaviors and they served the same purpose, then in some sense it wouldn't matter that they were technically different concepts, because the user wouldn't notice. The problem is the user does notice. So for example, I'll give you two examples of distinctions between the two. Categories can be used to label tabs so that you can organize your messages with tabs. You can't do that with labels. So there's a behavioral aspect that belongs to categories but not to labels. On the other side, you can label messages that are not in the inbox, but you can't categorize messages that are not in the inbox. So what this tells you is that labels and categories are actually incomparable behaviorally. One is not a subset of the other, and this is, I think, makes it a serious design flaw, because you'd like to have all of this power in a single concept so that you could apply it uniformly, but you're not able to do that.
So there is one question here asking if the issue at hand here is not the distinction between value and reference. I guess it's a reference to Frege and this notion of sense and reference.
Oh, wow. You might be getting outside my philosophical depth, Giancarlo. I mean, when I think of, I'm not sure if value and reference here is in that sense or in the more sort of traditional computer science sense. I mean, in some sense, you can think that concepts are connected by references. So, you know, a commenting concept has a reference to some kind of target that it comments on, which might be a post or whatever. And then the post has some value inside the post concept, which might be the text. That is the text of that post. And inside the concept, the value of the, so in the comment concept, the value of the comment might be the contents of the comment. So there's, I think, a productive distinction between value and reference, but I'm not sure how it plays out philosophically.
Mm-hmm. How do you incorporate human values as concepts in software system design? I will pick back on this question because you were for many years involved in dependable systems. And I guess one issue of dependability nowadays is trustworthiness and the whole discussion on ethical requirements these days.
Well, that's a really great question. Well, I would say, first of all, that I think there is a human value in having well-designed software and software that's easy and pleasant to use. And so I think doing good concept design is a service to humanity, as in doing any kind of good design. I would also say that, you know, I think there are, in the same way that, you know, we know there are dark patterns of user interface idioms, I think there are dark concepts, and that are often used to get people to behave in a way that is contrary to their own self-interests. And so I think a very interesting project would be to identify those dark concepts, and to root them out, to persuade people not to use those dark concepts.
No, in fact, so that the idea of tying concepts to purpose, which makes perfect sense, in a sense defers the problem to identifying purpose, right? It doesn't seem to be trivial always to identify purpose. And I was wondering if it has some connection, if you thought about the connection between this and the tradition of goal modeling in requirements engineering, so goal-oriented requirements engineering, and if what you are trying to produce there is, on one hand, eliciting goals, and on the other hand, eliciting affordances. And the relation between two is basically value, right? So value is the degree to which the affordances of a given artifact satisfy one's goals. So I was wondering if there is something there.
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's really a great question. I mean, I would say that I've certainly been influenced and thought about, you know, all this wonderful work on goals, such as the work that Axel van Lamsverde and Emmanuel Lettier have done on chaos and so on. I think that's very seminal and important work. I think their goals, their desire to be able to express the goals as temporal logic formulas often makes the goals more concrete than the purposes that I have in mind. I'm not sure how one would express a purpose such as achieving consistent formatting, which is my purpose for the style concept. I'm not sure how straightforward it would be to express that as a goal in a system like chaos, although I'm very interested in that question. I think that the question really is absolutely right, that coming up with purposes is very difficult, but I don't believe it's necessary to always have the purposes before you have the concepts. I think that there's a kind of back and forth design process that's possible. And this is one of the things that, if you look at the literature on design and what distinguishes design from engineering in the work, for example, of people like Nigel Cross, back in 30 or 40 years ago, trying to understand the essence of design, one of the things that many of these analyses pointed out was that engineers often try to characterize a problem very precisely and then build a solution for that problem. But designers tend to be more comfortable with allowing the design activity itself, the creation and exploration of potential solutions, to inspire questions and ideas about what the purposes and needs are. And so I'm quite comfortable with that idea. I think what's most important is that you always ask yourself, what is the purpose? And I should say that one of the things that's important with the idea of purposes for concepts is that I am saying, I think the provocative part of it is that each concept in your system needs to have its own purpose. It's not enough for them to have purposes in working together. It's not enough for the whole app to have a purpose. Each individual concept needs a purpose. And if you ask yourself what the concept of each purpose is, it can be very clarifying.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, that concepts should stand on their own, right? What's your vision of how conceptual design will be used by technology end users versus people who create software?
Well, I think concepts can play a role for all different kinds of people. They can play a role at the strategic level. When you're thinking about a system, you can say, what concepts will we need for the system to be a success? What are the concepts that define a product family, the applications that a company produces, that link together the activities of a company, and so on. So there's that notion on the one hand. there's the concepts in the design, in the user interaction design of the particular product, which is where I tend to focus most. That's the most obvious application of concepts. There's the concepts for the implementer and developer, because if they're not in line, with the designer's notion of concepts, then they won't be able to implement the system successfully. And then the end user's mental model, I take Don Norman's point of view here, that the system projects a system image, and that you want the mental model of the user to have in mind those concepts that are the same concepts as the designer's concepts. You want ideally a perfect alignment. That often won't be possible if the concepts are complicated, but ideally you have a perfect alignment between the user's concepts and the designer's concepts.
Yeah, that's what came to my mind. So the way I understand the Norman's idea of conceptual model is a kind of folk theory of how things work on the mind of the user, right?
Yes, I mean, I think that Don Norman, if you look in the design of everyday things, he is much more concerned with how the system presents the model to the user, because he's much more concerned about design of the user interface. In a sense, his whole book is about this idea of projection. The problem with the Norman door, the door that you don't know whether to pull or push, is, as he put it beautifully, that a door should not need to carry a user manual, namely a sign on it saying pull or push, right? So he wants, and so affordance is about conveying from the artifact to the user what the intended behavior is. And he thinks of conceptual models in the same way. The quality of the design is measured by the extent to which the design projects an accurate conceptual model. The question I would like to ask is a different one, which is, how do we come up with a model that is the perfect model? If not the perfect model, a good model, a model that fulfills the user's needs and has desirable properties as a conceptual model in and of itself. And then the question of how that model is projected by the user interface is a completely separate question. That's a question of presentation. And I think that's primarily the question that Don Norman has, and many people in user interface design have been concerned with.
So what do you suggest for software engineers to read to gain knowledge about the field of design? What they should read first to learn more about design?
Well, that's a good question. Well, if you haven't read it, you should certainly read Don Norman's book, Design of Everyday Things. I think that's a wonderful, entertaining, and thought-provoking book. I personally am a great fan of Christopher Alexander. I think if you've only come across Christopher Alexander, because he's quoted every time the Gang of Four and design patterns are mentioned, you might really enjoy reading some of Christopher Alexander's books. They're a big surprise if you haven't read them before, because they are, I always say they have a very strong religious component to them, which is very interesting, a spiritual component in his notion of design and what comprises good design. And you find that especially in the later books, in particular the latest, which is, I believe, called The Nature of Order, which is a multi-volume series. I also think his earliest book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, is a remarkable book and has some very useful insights about design. So those are some of my favorites.
I fully agree. That's a fantastic book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and starts with a quote from Plato saying that we should carve reality at its joints, right? That we should really search for the right concepts. So it might be argued that many natural concepts are designed by the human activity too. It's up to our conceptualization of reality to distinguish the concept zebra from the concept horse. I will again add to this that, authors like that, they even talk about social ontology, like John Searle, would say that the reason we say that the function of the heart is to pump blood is because we value life. If if on the other hand we value death, we would say that the function of the heart is to prevent you from dying, for example.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this is aligned with Michael Polanyi's idea that a machine cannot be understood in terms of its physical behavior. He points out that a physicist can't explain how a clock works. I like to think of, imagining that you present, Isaac Newton with Facebook, right? You know, even if you gave him a complete mathematical description in predicate logic of how Facebook behaved, he still wouldn't be able to make any sense of it. Or just think about a toaster, right? If I presented a toaster to Isaac Newton, how would I explain it to him? You know, the physics of the toaster would actually be irrelevant. What I'd need to say is, I'd need to show him how this is used, what its purpose is. You put some bread in, you push the lever down, and the bread comes out slightly, you know, toasted and burnt. And we like eating burnt bread. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm not convinced that that the concept of horse or zebra is the same as the concept of, you know, of restaurant reservation or of an election or a poll, or, you know, we have, or the notion of marriage, for example. So we create all these these concepts that are essentially policies and protocols in our society because they have an end goal for us, and we design elaborate behaviors around them. And I don't see that happening in the distinction between, you know, a cat and a tiger. I think these are classification exercises which are very different from invention exercises.
So again, about goals and the purpose. So someone here is asking, Stephen is asking, are they synonymous, overlapping, separate? Can you elaborate on the exact relation between purpose and goals? I guess in this tradition of goal-oriented requirements engineering.
So I would say that goals often have a more concrete sense of some kind of, in the simplest sense, some kind of predicate on states that you're trying to reach. You know, if the the goal is to reach your destination. Goals, of course, in languages like chaos can be much richer than that. They can be full temporal logic properties. But I think of purposes as more situated in the human domain. So, you know, the purpose of consistent formatting for style, or let's say that let's consider the purpose of restaurant reservations. I would rather think about it not so much in terms of, you know, the purpose is that the goal is that if I make a restaurant reservation, it will be there in the system. That I think of as the operational principle. The operational principle is that if I reserve a table at a restaurant, then when I turn up at the restaurant, they will have a table for me. That I think of not as a goal, but as an operational principle. The purpose of restaurant reservations is something to do with efficient allocation, right? It's both so that actually it's efficient allocation both from the user's point of view, that they should be able to have confidence that the resource that they want to use will be available, and from the restaurant owner's point of view, that they can have confidence that their tables will actually be full. And so I see the purpose more as situated in the domain. The purpose is the motivation for using that particular concept.
Daniel, I could be here the whole day discussing these things with you, but I think we have to wrap up. You are also, I mean, I'm sure I'm talking on behalf of the entire community. We thank you very, very much for this fantastic talk, in particular for taking time off from your vacations to, you know, and doing this from your car. I really, really appreciate it. And, you know, for the generosity for being here and giving this talk and answering these questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been really delightful, and I've so enjoyed these very provocative and inspiring questions that people have asked. And so if people would like to follow up by email, I'd be really delighted to continue these conversations. And thank you so much to you, Giancarlo, for hosting this. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much again.